The winters in the northern range had grown sharper in recent years. The air no longer whispered cold, it screamed it. Trees stood like brittle bones against a colorless sky, and even the birds had stopped returning by mid-October. For most people in the valley, the season was one of retreat. Locked doors, stacked wood, silence. But for Elias, it was just another stretch of time. He lived alone on a patch of land passed down through 2 generations. The house, crooked and patched with tin, leaned slightly east. Its chimney rarely smoked, not because there wasn't wood, but because Elias had grown used to the cold. It reminded him he was still here. Most days passed in rhythm, feeding the hens, checking the fence line, making sure the well hadn't frozen. He didn't expect visitors, didn't want them. The world had grown loud, and he preferred its quiet echoes from behind the hills. Until the night the snow fell sideways, and something moved in his barn. At first he thought it was a shadow, then maybe a trick of the wind. But when he stepped inside, lantern held low, his breath caught. There, curled in the farthest corner on a bed of half-rotted hay, lay a leopard. Not the sleek, golden kind from storybooks. This one was battered, its coat matted with blood and ice, one paw swollen, breathing shallow, and yet its eyes were open, watching him. Elias didn't move. The stories he'd heard growing up returned in fragments. Leopards were ghosts, beautiful, untouchable, brutal. If you saw one and lived, you didn't talk about it. You thanked the mountain and moved on. But this one wasn't a ghost, it was dying. And somehow it had come to him. He should have walked away, let nature finish what it started. Instead he knelt, not close, just near enough to see the rise and fall of its chest. "I won't touch you," he whispered mostly to himself. "But if you want to stay, then stay." He backed out slowly, left the barn door half closed, and returned to the house. That night he couldn't sleep, not because he feared the animal, but because, for the first time in years, he wasn't the only living thing on the property that wasn't afraid to die there. The next morning the leopard hadn't moved, but it was breathing. Elias placed a metal bowl just inside the barn door, filled it with water, a bit of bone broth, some shredded meat he'd been saving. When he returned at dusk, the bowl was empty. The animal was still watching, so he brought more, and more, until the snow began to melt. And one morning, the leopard was gone. No tracks, no blood, no sound, just the flattened hay, and the hollow that remembered it. For days, Elias stared at the empty corner of the barn like it might answer back. He hadn't named the animal, hadn't touched it, had barely spoken aloud during the entire ordeal. But the absence now hung thicker than the storm that had first blown it in. He kept setting out the bowl, just in case, and each morning he'd find it undisturbed, full, still warm from the night before. The hens returned to their usual chatter. The wind softened, but the silence in Elias's chest grew, because something had shifted, and not just in the snow. It was a week later when he heard the cry, not from the barn, from the tree line. A sharp, guttural sound, short, clipped, not pain exactly, but insistence. Elias stood at his porch, heart hammering. He didn't see the leopard, but he saw the shape it left in the snow. Footprints, fresh, leading toward the barn, and beside them, smaller ones, lighter, narrower. He followed. Inside the barn, the hay had been moved again, but the corner wasn't empty this time. There, nestled against the remains of old cloth and dried moss, lay a cub, not more than a few weeks old, eyes barely open, breathing steady, alone, but placed carefully, not abandoned, delivered. Elias didn't know what to do, didn't know if the mother would return, didn't know if feeding this one would bring her back or keep her away. He only knew what had been done for him. A trust had been extended, not by words, but by choice. So he knelt, like before, and whispered, "If you want to stay, then stay." Then he rose, backed out slowly, and waited for night to fall. The cub was still there the next morning, and the one after that, and the one after that. Elias began to feed it, little by little. Milk, soaked bread, scraps of boiled meat. He didn't touch it, only left the food near the hay and watched from a distance. On the 5th day, the cub limped toward the bowl instead of waiting. By the 7th, it stared at him while eating. By the 10th, it no longer flinched when he approached. Elias found himself talking again. Not loudly, never that, but in murmurs. Words like, easy, or you'll be fine. Sometimes he just sat in the barn with the cub, letting the silence hold them both. He started calling it Ash, for the gray dust that clung to its fur. He never meant to name it, but once said, the name stuck. The mother never returned. Not to the barn, not that Elias could see, but sometimes at night he thought he saw movement at the tree line. A dark flash between trunks, a pause, and then gone. He began leaving scraps farther out. They always disappeared by morning. No tracks, no sound. But a rhythm had formed, a shared understanding, stretched between spaces. Ash grew quickly. By the time spring thawed the first layer of frost, he was already bounding around the barn, chasing shadows, practicing silence. And Elias, for the first time in years, laughed out loud. Not because something was funny, but because something was alive. And that aliveness changed everything. He began rising earlier, just to hear Ash stir, began mending the barn roof. Repaired the fence line not for the hens, but to make sure Ash could run freely and safely. One afternoon, he built a small perch from reclaimed wood, a platform near the barn's rafters where Ash could lie and watch the world. The cub claimed it instantly. Elias added a second bowl, not because Ash needed it, but because it felt like something shared creatures should have. Choices. At night, he sat on the steps and watched the tree line, not with expectation, but gratitude. Some nights the trees were still, some nights they whispered, and once, just once, he thought he saw eyes. Not threatening, not curious, just watching. Ash began to mimic him in odd ways, circling before settling, pausing to listen before eating, nudging a chicken gently aside instead of pouncing. It wasn't training. It was something quieter, mirroring, trust made visible in gesture. And sometimes, as Elias drifted to sleep, he imagined a world full of ashes, creatures raised not by dominance, but by decency, not told how to behave, just shown. And for the first time in a long time, he no longer felt like a man holding off the end of something. He felt like a man standing at the start, and the world somehow seemed to sense it. Birdsong returned before the thaw had fully taken hold. A family of foxes started crossing the field at dawn, unbothered by the scent of predator. Even the sky looked different, less burdened, more open. Elias told himself it was just spring, but deep down he knew better. Ash began exploring farther. Each day his range grew wider. He would vanish into the trees for hours at a time, returning with burrs in his fur and a look Elias recognized. Freedom without fear. One morning, Elias opened the barn to find Ash gone. No prints, no signs of struggle, just absence. The silence hit harder this time. He waited. An hour, a day, 2. But on the 3rd day, Ash returned. Not alone. Trailing behind him was another cub, slightly smaller, limping, and behind that, for only a moment, a glimpse of the mother. She did not enter the barn. She did not stay, but she nodded. Or maybe Elias imagined it, and then she vanished. The 2 cubs curled together in the same patch of hay. Ash didn't look at Elias for approval. He didn't need to. He already knew. And Elias. He knelt just like the first night, placed a second bowl, and whispered, "If you want to stay, then stay." That spring turned to summer gently, as if the valley itself had learned to breathe softer. The 2 cubs, Ash and the newcomer Elias, quietly named Ember, became fixtures on the land. Ember was smaller, slower, but just as observant. She watched Ash, and Ash watched Elias, and between the 3 of them, a strange rhythm took hold. But not everyone in the valley lived in rhythm. One afternoon, while repairing the western fence, Elias heard the low hum of a truck engine on the ridge. He hadn't seen another vehicle near his property in nearly a year. He stood still, hammer in hand, and waited. 2 men appeared at the tree line, one holding a long camera lens, the other something longer, a rifle. They didn't see Elias at first. They were watching something farther in. Ash. He was sunning himself near the barn, stretched and relaxed, unaware. Elias moved quickly, quiet but sure. He crossed the field with purpose, the years falling from his legs like dust. "Hey!" he barked. The word tore from him, sudden and unfamiliar. The men startled. The one with the camera lifted both hands. The other hesitated, lowered the rifle slowly. "Didn't know anyone lived here," the cameraman said. "Local authorities said this place was abandoned." "It's not," Elias said. His voice cracked, but his eyes didn't. "What's that?" the rifleman asked, nodding toward Ash. "Family," Elias replied. The men exchanged a glance. The rifleman looked unconvinced. "Dangerous to keep something like that uncontained." Elias stepped forward. "More dangerous to think you understand what doesn't belong to you." There was something final in his tone. Eventually they left. No promises, no apologies, just the slow grind of tires over gravel. Elias watched until the dust settled. Ash was still in the grass, but now alert. He hadn't run, hadn't hidden. He had watched, trusted. That night Elias didn't sleep. He stayed near the barn, a shovel in hand, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. He didn't know what might come next, only that if it did, he wouldn't run either. By morning, the cubs were curled beside him, not for warmth, for presence. And for the first time, Elias felt not just alive, he felt needed, and that made all the difference. From that day on, Elias began to walk the land differently. Not cautiously, not like a man expecting something to be taken, but like someone preparing to pass something on. He added a second gate to the barn, not for protection, but for invitation. He left trails of dried meat and berries further into the woods, marking a subtle boundary, one that respected the wild but welcomed its return. Ash began sleeping closer to the porch. Ember began mimicking Elias's morning rituals, circling the coop, waiting by the well, pausing to look west before sunrise. And the birds didn't fly away anymore when Elias walked through the fields. Even the sky felt different, like it had stopped watching and started listening. One evening, as orange bled into the hills, Elias sat on the porch and saw something that made him hold his breath. A third figure, at the edge of the woods. Not the mother, not another cub, a full-grown leopard. Larger than Ash, older, scarred, but it didn't approach, didn't threaten. It simply lowered its head, held the posture, then disappeared. Ash stood behind Elias, watching too, not growling, just watching. And Elias whispered, "There are more," not out of fear, out of hope, because something had changed in the land. Not just safety, but permission, permission to stay, permission to return, permission to belong, and maybe, just maybe, to heal. And healing, Elias learned, wasn't loud. It didn't come with grand gestures or sudden epiphanies. It crept in quietly like moss reclaiming a stone, like breath returning to cold lungs, like laughter echoing in a place where silence once ruled. Some mornings he would find fresh paw prints in the mud near the well, too large for Ash, too light to be Ember. He never followed them, never needed to. The fact that they were there was enough. Other times he'd leave the barn door open and return to find feathers missing from the hay, never scattered, never torn, just gone, as if someone had borrowed softness. He began carving small notches into the porch rail, one for each day the land spoke back. Some days it was a returning bird. Some days it was a glimpse of gold in the brush. Some days it was just the feeling of being watched in the kindest way. The cubs grew fast. Ash became leaner, stronger, still silent but sure. Ember remained curious, cautious but bold. They still returned to the barn to sleep, but more often now Elias found them at the tree line, sitting side by side, ears twitching to things only they could hear. One evening, long after the leaves had begun to turn again, Elias stood on the hill behind his house and watched the valley breathe. He didn't need to be needed anymore. He had been, and now he simply was. The barn still stood, the water still ran, and deep in the woods, things that once feared man had begun to draw near, not for conquest, not for curiosity, but for coexistence. And Elias, in his quiet way, knew that was the truest kind of return, not just of the animals to the land, but of Elias to himself. He had become something more than caretaker, more than witness. He had become part of the rhythm. When Ember didn't return one night, Elias didn't panic. He sat by the barn and waited. And before dawn, she came bounding through the tall grass, a bird's feather clinging to her whiskers like a trophy. Ash followed close behind, slower, deliberate, his eyes softer than they'd ever been. They didn't stay long. They drank, rested, and then vanished again. But this time, Elias didn't feel the absence as a loss. He felt it as a gift, because they returned not out of need, but by choice, and that was everything. The wild no longer feared his presence, and he no longer feared the silence, because now he understood what comes back was never truly gone. It had only been waiting for the right kind of welcome. What comes back was never truly gone. It had only been waiting for the right kind of welcome. That welcome, Elias realized, was no longer just his to give. One morning, he found Ember standing alone at the edge of the field, her ears pricked, her body still. Elias followed her gaze and saw two more shapes near the tree line. They weren't cubs, they weren't familiar, yet Ember took a step forward, then another, and the strangers didn't flee. Ash appeared behind her, calm, silent. He joined Ember in the tall grass. Together they stood, a quiet, unspoken bridge between what once was and what could be. Elias didn't interfere. He knew what this was, the passing of rhythm. A moment later, the leopards turned and vanished into the forest, Ember and Ash alongside them. They didn't look back. Elias stood in the field for a long time, long enough for the wind to shift, long enough for the sun to reach his face. He felt no grief, only a strange, full peace, because they had left the way they had come, on their own terms, and what they left behind wasn't absence. It was continuation. The barn remained. The paths they wore into the grass remained. The notches on the porch, the bowls by the door, the sounds he now understood, all remained, as did he. And somewhere deep in the woods, when the wind moved just right, he swore he could hear them still. Not calling for him, not crying, just remembering, like he would, always. Autumn came again, crisp and gold, and with it a silence that no longer carried weight. Elias spent more time in the woods, not to look for them, but to walk where they once did. He discovered new paths, trees clawed by playful paws, a sun-bleached log used as a lookout. Sometimes he'd find a fresh feather placed neatly on his porch. Never torn, never windblown, just set there, like a token, like a message. The valley grew quieter in winter, but never empty. Now and then, he'd see a movement just beyond his vision, or hear a soft huff in the dark. He would nod toward it and return to his tea. They were still out there, and they still knew where home was. That was enough. One morning, years later, a young boy from a neighboring village found his way to Elias's farm. Eyes wide, boots too big. He said his grandfather had told him about the old man who once fed a ghost in the barn. Elias chuckled. He showed the boy the barn, the tree line, the notches on the porch. Then he handed him a feather. "Place it where they'll find it," he said. The boy did, and as he turned to leave, Elias swore he saw a shape in the woods, low, silent, watching, and when he turned back, the feather was gone, just like before. Not a story ending, just another beginning. That evening, Elias carved one last notch into the rail, not for a visit, not for a sign, but for the boy, for the look in his eyes, the same mix of awe and curiosity Elias once saw in Ash. He knew then, the story no longer belonged to him alone, and maybe in time, the boy would pass it on too, to someone else, to something else, a gesture, a silence, a feather left just right. That's how legacies survive, Elias thought, not in the roar of a name shouted through history, but in the softest of footsteps, repeated, remembered, respected. And on the final morning, Elias walked the land. The sky was clear, the wind warm, the world still. He paused at the barn, ran his hand over the wooden frame that once shielded more than just animals. Then he sat by the porch, tea in hand, gaze on the tree line. A shadow moved, a shape paused. Two golden eyes blinked once, Slowly, he smiled. Not a goodbye, just an acknowledgement. Because this place didn't need farewells. It only needed presence. When the neighbors found him hours later, he was still sitting upright, peaceful, unmoved. The tea had long gone cold, but beside his hand, one last feather, lay gently, deliberately, left not in mourning, but in memory. And the wind carried nothing away that day. It only settled deeper, like roots, like rhythm, like legacy. And legacy, Elias understood in his final hour, wasn't what one left behind. It was what kept walking after you. It was in the softened earth where paws once pressed, in the wind that no longer startled the trees, in the silence that echoed with memory, not emptiness, and in the young ones who would one day pass through the valley, not to conquer it, but to belong to it. His home would stand, if only in the way it was remembered, not in brick or timber, but in story, in breath, in a boy's voice retelling what he saw by the barn, in a feather placed without words, in a shape moving just beyond sight. The world would change, it always did, but there would be places that remembered how to stay the same, not in form, but in feeling, and in those places Elias would always be known, not as the man who tamed the wild, but as the one who listened to it. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.